What happens when a king discovers that the most explosive threat to his reign comes from within his own family? Imagine standing in Buckingham Palace, the weight of centuries pressing down on your shoulders, and hearing a secret that could topple the monarchy from top to bottom. That was the moment when Prince Harry walked into King Charles's life, carrying a revelation that nobody, not even the closest aides, could have anticipated. The very foundations of the royal family were trembling, and the story that was about to unfold would shock the world. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. It all began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Rumors had been circulating for months. Whispers that Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, was preparing a new project. Not a charity initiative, not a routine interview, but something far more significant. A project that insiders hinted could redefine the public's perception of the monarchy. What exactly was she planning? What could possibly compel Harry to approach his father with urgency and fear in his voice? These questions formed the backdrop of a tension-filled drama that was quietly escalating within the palace walls. From the outside, life looked normal. Buckingham Palace remained an iconic symbol of continuity and tradition. The gardens flourished, the guards marched in perfect unison, and ceremonial routines continued without disruption. Yet, behind the closed doors, there was a storm brewing, one that threatened to rewrite history. The palace had weathered scandals before, affairs, divorces, political controversies, but this was different. This wasn't just about appearances or public perception. It was about trust, betrayal, and the fragile balance between family loyalty and royal duty. Prince Harry had always been caught between two worlds, the rigid, tradition-bound expectations of the monarchy and his desire for independence, freedom, and personal happiness. His marriage to Meghan Markle had brought a new dynamic to the royal family, one that was not always welcomed by every member. The tension was palpable, simmering beneath the surface, occasionally erupting in moments that would make headlines worldwide. But nothing had prepared anyone for what Harry revealed to his father that day. When Harry arrived, he carried more than just words. He carried urgency. His steps were measured but determined, each one echoing through the palace corridors as if heralding the gravity of what was to come. The meeting with King Charles was not scheduled in the usual way, not with the polished formalities or carefully orchestrated protocols of palace life. This was personal. This was urgent. The king, seasoned by decades of public service and diplomatic negotiations, sensed immediately that something was different. He could feel the tension radiating from his son. And then Harry spoke. "Father," he began, voice steady but edged with anxiety. "Meghan is planning something, and it could change everything." The king's reaction was subtle but telling. A brief pause, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker of uncertainty in the eyes of a man used to controlling situations with precision. He leaned forward, urging his son to continue. What followed next was a revelation so potent, so charged, that it seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy, refusing to dissipate. Harry explained that Meghan was working on a project, a tell-all initiative targeting senior members of the royal family. The implications were staggering. Not just a story for the press or a fleeting scandal, but a comprehensive exposé, one that insiders claimed could shake the monarchy to its very core. The king's mind raced. Questions spiraled in rapid succession. How much did Harry know? How accurate was this information? Could it be prevented? Should it be prevented? The tension in the room was almost tangible, an invisible pressure pressing down on both father and son. Harry's expression mirrored the gravity of the situation, a mix of loyalty, fear, and desperation. He was caught between two allegiances, his devotion to Meghan and his duty to his family. And now, that conflict had reached a breaking point. Outside the walls of the palace, the world remained oblivious. Public life continued its familiar rhythms, unaware that a private crisis of monumental proportions was unfolding behind the gilded doors. But within those walls, every glance, every gesture, every whispered word carried significance. Even the aides, accustomed to handling sensitive matters, could sense the weight of the revelation. Some speculated, some worried, and some silently feared the outcome. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. To understand why this moment mattered so profoundly, one must consider the delicate balance of the monarchy itself. It is an institution built on centuries of tradition, ceremonial rituals, and unspoken rules of conduct. Loyalty is expected, discretion demanded, and any breach of trust can have repercussions far beyond the individuals involved. The monarchy is not just a family. It is a symbol, a living embodiment of national history and continuity. Any disruption within its inner circle reverberates through society, media, and politics alike. Harry's warning was not just a personal concern. It was a potential institutional crisis. What could Meghan's project contain that was so dangerous, so transformative, that it would compel her husband to risk everything by delivering this warning to his father? The answers were elusive, cloaked in mystery and speculation. Some suggested it involved personal grievances. Others believed it might expose hidden truths about decisions made in the upper echelons of the royal family. Whatever the content, the mere possibility of a public disclosure of internal disputes represented a profound threat. King Charles, experienced in navigating complex public and private dynamics, now faced a moral and strategic dilemma. How does a monarch respond when a potential internal threat emerges? Do you confront it head-on, risking further escalation, or do you attempt to contain it quietly, hoping that discretion will prevent disaster? The options were fraught with danger, each carrying consequences that could ripple through generations. Every choice seemed to tighten the knot of tension, every moment increasing the stakes. As Harry spoke, the king's mind traced the delicate web of relationships, loyalties, and past conflicts. He recalled moments of tension between Harry and Meghan, glimpses of friction with other family members, and the challenges of maintaining unity while preserving individual autonomy. Every recollection added weight to the revelation, a reminder that personal dynamics within the royal family are inseparable from the broader narrative of monarchy and duty. The conversation was intense, yet beneath the surface, subtle emotions played their own roles. There was fear. Fear of public exposure, fear of personal betrayal, fear of destabilizing an institution. There was hope that reason, dialogue, and careful management could prevent a catastrophe. And there was loyalty, complicated and tangled, pulling both father and son in multiple directions at once. Amidst this swirling storm of emotions, Harry and Charles both understood that the situation could not remain static. Action, or inaction, would define the next chapter of their family history. And so, they faced the unthinkable, the potential need for decisive measures that might involve distancing, confrontation, or even expulsion from the inner circle. The weight of centuries of tradition pressed upon them, amplifying the gravity of every decision. The tension in the room built steadily, like a coiled spring waiting to release its energy. Every word, every pause, every subtle gesture mattered. And yet, the most critical question remained unanswered. How would the king respond? How would the palace handle the revelation that a tell-all project loomed on the horizon, threatening to alter the perception of the monarchy forever? The answers were uncertain, the stakes immense, and the clock relentlessly ticking. As the meeting concluded, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Harry left, leaving Charles alone to contemplate the unfolding drama. The corridors, once bustling with routine activity, now seemed charged with invisible energy, as though the very walls of the palace were aware of the storm gathering within. Outside, the world continued in blissful ignorance, unaware that the balance of power, loyalty, and trust had been irrevocably challenged. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It all began with a whisper. A soft murmur that traveled through palace corridors like a ghost, barely noticed at first, yet impossible to ignore once it settled into the minds of those who heard it. Whispers are dangerous. They carry secrets, speculation, and sometimes the power to ignite chaos. And in this case, the whisper centered on Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex. The rumor was simple, yet incendiary. She was planning something new, something that could alter the balance of the royal family forever. At first, it seemed like just another story in the endless saga of palace intrigue. The royal family had weathered scandals before, divorces, disagreements, offhand comments leaked to the press. But this felt different. The whisper suggested intention, strategy, even a certain defiance. Insiders hinted at a project, ambitious, meticulous, and potentially explosive. It wasn't a casual interview or a small charity announcement. It was something else entirely. Something that, if it reached the public, could shatter the carefully constructed facade of unity and loyalty. The whisper reached Harry first, not through the tabloids, not through aides, not even through careful rumors whispered in the halls of the palace. No, he heard it through fragments, passing remarks, half-finished sentences, subtle indications that Meghan was thinking bigger than ever before. Initially, he tried to dismiss it. He tried to tell himself it was exaggeration, paranoia, a misinterpretation of casual remarks. But deep down, he knew something was brewing. And unlike others, he had a personal stake in it. Imagine being caught between two worlds, the expectations of an institution steeped in centuries of tradition, and the life you've built with someone whose ambitions defy convention. Harry felt the tension in every fiber of his being. He had always been aware of the delicate line he walked. Loyalty to family versus loyalty to his wife. Duty to the monarchy versus duty to the truth as he saw it. And now, that line was blurring in ways he could neither ignore nor control. The first hint of the whisper came at an unremarkable event, a quiet afternoon meeting with a few close aides. Harry overheard a conversation, fragments of sentences, almost like static on a radio. Project, targeting senior royals, could change public perception. The words struck him like a cold wind. He excused himself politely, but the echo of the phrases lingered. It wasn't just the content of what was being said, it was the conviction in the voices, the certainty that this wasn't a passing thought, but a deliberate plan. From there, Harry's awareness sharpened. He began connecting dots others might have missed. Every late-night phone call, every hurried conversation, every subtle reference in Meghan's circle suddenly took on significance. It was as if a hidden narrative was unfolding, one that had been invisible until he tuned into it. And as the pieces came together, the scope of the situation began to crystallize. This wasn't a personal gripe or a fleeting complaint. It was a calculated move, a potential upheaval that could reverberate through the monarchy in ways that were almost unimaginable. For Harry, the realization brought a mixture of emotions. There was fear. Fear of public fallout, of judgment, of the consequences that might ripple across the family and the institution. There was doubt. How could he navigate this without betraying someone he loved? Without undermining the very family he was born into? And there was a growing sense of inevitability, a quiet understanding that some action would be required. He could no longer remain a passive observer. As the whisper intensified, it spread through the palace like a subtle contagion. A passing comment from a staff member here, an ambiguous email there, a hushed discussion in the corridors. All these minor signals contributed to a mounting sense of urgency. The palace, usually a place of carefully controlled appearances, was quietly being infiltrated by tension. Even the most experienced aides began to sense that something significant was unfolding, though few could articulate exactly what. It's important to pause here and consider the power of a whisper. In ordinary life, a whisper is easily dismissed, often forgotten. But in the context of the royal family, where appearances and perception are everything, a whisper can become a spark, igniting suspicions, anxieties, and even confrontations. In this case, the whisper carried a weight that transcended gossip. It hinted at a deliberate strategy, a plan with consequences that could extend far beyond the palace walls. And then came the moment when Harry realized that the whisper could not remain private. He had to act, but acting meant making a decision fraught with complexity. He could confront Meghan, seeking clarification. He could attempt to gather more evidence, delaying immediate action. Or he could take the extraordinary step of approaching King Charles directly, revealing the potential threat and trusting his father to understand both the personal and institutional stakes. The decision was not simple. Harry knew that speaking to the king could be perceived as betrayal, a violation of marital trust, a fracture in their partnership. Yet remaining silent could risk the very foundation of the family he loved and the monarchy he had sworn to uphold. The tension weighed heavily on him, a constant presence in every thought, every interaction, every decision. Before he acted, Harry spent nights reflecting, pacing quietly through the corridors of his residence, replaying fragments of conversations, analyzing nuances, questioning motives. He considered Meghan's perspective, her ambitions, her frustrations, her sense of being misunderstood or constrained by tradition. He considered the king's perspective, the burden of legacy, the responsibility to the institution, the constant scrutiny of public and press alike. And in the quiet hours, a plan began to form, a course of action that he hoped would balance loyalty, honesty, and responsibility. The whisper, initially so soft and almost ignorable, had become a driving force. It demanded attention, demanded action, demanded resolution. And as Harry prepared to confront the situation, he felt the weight of history pressing upon him. The knowledge that every choice in a family like this echoes far beyond the immediate moment, shaping narratives, perceptions, and the course of generations. He arranged the meeting. There was no grand announcement, no ceremonial prelude, just a quiet understanding that something had to be addressed, and he alone would deliver the message. Walking through the familiar halls of Buckingham Palace, Harry felt an unusual mix of determination and apprehension. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if he were carrying the expectations of his ancestors along with the fragile hopes of his immediate family. The moment of confrontation loomed, and yet even in anticipation, the whisper lingered, echoing in his mind. What exactly would Meghan reveal? What would be the consequences of her ambitions? Could a project, however well-intentioned, truly destabilize the monarchy? And most importantly, how would the king respond? These questions swirled like storm clouds, darkening the horizon of an already tense situation. When Harry finally entered the room where Charles awaited, the air seemed charged with an almost electric tension. Words hung unsaid, glances measured, and the very walls of the palace seemed to recognize the gravity of the moment. Harry's voice, though calm, carried urgency. The whisper that had started it all was about to be articulated, and the consequences, though uncertain, were inevitable. And as Harry prepared to speak, to reveal the secret that had been building in shadows and murmurs, the room seemed to hold its breath. Every heartbeat, every exhalation, every subtle gesture mattered. And then, with a weight that neither father nor son could fully comprehend, Harry spoke the words that would ignite the next chapter of this unfolding drama. But what came next would test loyalty, love, and legacy in ways no one could have anticipated, and it all began with that whisper. It was not a meeting anyone had anticipated. There were no formal invitations, no polished announcements, no meticulous planning to fit the rigid protocols of Buckingham Palace. This was something different, urgent, personal, unavoidable. Prince Harry had arrived unannounced, and the tension in the air was palpable. Every step he took echoed through the corridors like a drumbeat, a signal that something significant was about to unfold. The palace itself seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. The guards, normally stoic and unyielding, shifted ever so slightly, eyes flicking with curiosity and concern. Staff members whispered quietly, exchanging glances that spoke volumes without words. Even the familiar paintings lining the halls seemed to hold their breath, their stoic faces witnesses to a drama decades in the making. Harry knew the risks. Approaching King Charles directly about Meghan's project was fraught with complexity. It could be seen as betrayal, an overstep, or a rupture in trust. But staying silent was even riskier. The whisper that had begun in hushed tones had grown into a storm, and he could no longer ignore its power. This meeting would set the tone for everything that followed. As he entered the private sitting room, Charles looked up. Years of public life, diplomacy, and crisis management had honed the king's ability to read a room, to detect subtleties others might miss. And in that moment, he saw it, the tension radiating from his son, a mixture of loyalty, fear, and desperation that could not be concealed. Charles gestured for Harry to sit, and for a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with anticipation. "Father," Harry began, his voice measured but carrying an edge of urgency. "There's something you need to know." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was anything but. Charles leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing, mind racing. He had faced political scandals, public scrutiny, and media storms before, but nothing quite like this. A potential internal crisis that involved the delicate fabric of family, duty, and reputation. Harry continued, carefully choosing each word. He explained that Meghan was working on a project, one that insiders suggested could expose sensitive aspects of the royal family, revealing private tensions and internal conflicts to the public. The implications were staggering. This was not just about public perception. It was about trust, control, and the very foundation of the monarchy. Charles absorbed every detail, weighing each phrase, listening for nuance, searching for hidden meanings. He was no stranger to crisis management, but this situation was different. It involved not policy or diplomacy, but family. Loyalty versus duty. Private ambition versus institutional stability. And the man sitting across from him was not a stranger or advisor, but his own son, caught in the crossfire of personal and institutional allegiance. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of the conversation. Words became heavier, pauses longer, and glances more meaningful. Harry's expressions betrayed a mixture of anxiety and resolve. He knew that every detail mattered, every tone conveyed intention. He explained that he had tried to discern Meghan's intentions, to understand the full scope of the project, but the hints he had gathered suggested a potential public revelation that could be damaging, if not catastrophic, for the monarchy. Charles remained calm on the surface, but internally, a storm raged. He considered the options: confrontation, containment, negotiation, or preemptive action. Each choice carried risk. Confronting Meghan directly could escalate tensions, potentially worsening the situation. Containment relied on uncertainty and hope. Negotiation required transparency, which might not be forthcoming. Preemptive action risked personal and public backlash. The calculus was complex, the stakes unprecedented. Harry sensed the weight of his father's consideration. He pressed on, emphasizing the urgency and gravity of the situation. "Father, this isn't just a rumor anymore. There are indications that it's moving forward. Timelines are being considered, and the potential impact is massive. The family could be exposed in ways that we can't control." Charles listened intently, absorbing the magnitude of the revelation. He considered Meghan's perspective, her frustrations with public scrutiny, her desire for autonomy, her ambitions. He also weighed the implications for the institution he now led. Every choice had consequences. Every action or inaction rippled outward, affecting public perception, family relationships, and the stability of the monarchy itself. The tension in the room was thick, punctuated by brief silences where neither man spoke, yet communication occurred in every glance, every subtle shift in posture. The palace, usually a place of routine and ceremony, had become the stage for an intimate crisis of extraordinary proportions. The walls themselves seemed to recognize the gravity of the moment, enclosing the two men in a bubble of anticipation and uncertainty. Harry's voice broke the silence. "I need you to understand, Father, that this is coming. We can't ignore it. We have to prepare for what it could mean, not just for the family, but for the monarchy as a whole." Charles nodded slowly, acknowledging the reality, though the full implications were still unfolding in his mind. He considered the ripple effects, public reaction, media speculation, political scrutiny, and, most importantly, the personal relationships at the heart of the royal family. This was more than strategy. It was a test of judgment, empathy, and resolve. The discussion deepened, moving into specifics, though much remained unspoken, implied, or carefully framed. Harry shared what he could without compromising loyalty, offering glimpses of the potential content, timelines, and motivations behind Meghan's project. Charles absorbed it all, connecting dots, evaluating probabilities, and considering contingencies. Each revelation heightened the stakes, creating a sense of urgency that demanded immediate attention. Yet, even as the conversation unfolded, both men understood that much was uncertain. The full extent of Meghan's intentions, the actual content of the project, and the timing were all variables beyond their immediate control. The tension was compounded by the fact that every action could have unintended consequences, each ripple potentially magnifying the original problem. As the meeting progressed, Harry revealed one more crucial detail. He had learned that the project was not just about narrative or perception. It could influence public opinion, sway political sentiment, and challenge long-standing traditions. This elevated the situation from a private family matter to a potential national issue. The gravity of the revelation was not lost on Charles, who now faced a choice that could define his reign. The king's mind raced through scenarios, recalling past crises, internal conflicts, and the lessons of experience. He considered the delicate balance of visibility and discretion, tradition and innovation, authority and empathy. Every decision carried weight, every pause required judgment, and every word had consequences. The conversation was no longer just informational. It was strategic, a negotiation of reality, perception, and power. Harry's presence, his urgency, and his loyalty all converged to create a moment of unprecedented intensity. He had crossed a threshold, bringing the whisper into the open, transforming speculation into actionable intelligence. And Charles, seasoned yet human, now had to determine how to respond, to protect the institution, to safeguard the family, and to navigate a path through uncertainty and potential conflict. As the meeting drew toward a temporary close, both men understood that this was only the beginning. The whisper had become a conversation, and the conversation had created momentum that could not be reversed. Decisions would have to be made, alliances tested, and strategies deployed. The palace, with all its history, ceremony, and tradition, was now the epicenter of a private storm with public consequences. But just as Harry left the room, Charles realized something that made his heart tighten. The situation was moving faster than anticipated. Every choice he made, every action or restraint, would shape the next chapter. And the next revelation, whatever it was already on the horizon, waiting to challenge both father and son in ways neither could fully predict. The moment ended, but the tension lingered, a tangible pulse in the palace air. Outside, the world continued in oblivious rhythm, unaware that a private crisis had begun, one that could redefine family, duty, and legacy. And inside, both men knew that what came next would test them in ways that were unimaginable, impossible, and unavoidable. But what came next would change everything, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the palace walls. It was the question that lingered like a shadow over every corridor of the palace. What exactly was in Meghan's alleged project? Rumors swirled, fragmentary and contradictory, but the substance remained elusive. Everyone had a theory, yet no one knew the full story. Insiders hinted at explosive revelations, but the specifics were shrouded in secrecy, hidden behind layers of intent, discretion, and ambition. And that mystery was precisely what made it so terrifying and so compelling. At first, it was easy to dismiss the project as another fleeting media spectacle, another attempt to grab attention. After all, the royal family had endured controversies before, some far more public, some far more personal. But something about this whisper suggested it was different. There was a calculated precision behind it, a deliberate orchestration that implied forethought, strategy, and perhaps even a hint of defiance. It was not merely about airing grievances. It was about shaping a narrative that could resonate worldwide. Harry himself had struggled to piece together what he knew. Every conversation he had with Meghan, every casual remark, every cryptic message seemed to carry hidden significance. He realized that the project was not just a personal expression. It was a potential game-changer, something that could impact public perception, political discourse, and even the stability of the monarchy. The weight of the revelation pressed on him, not just as a son concerned for his father, but as a husband aware of the power and consequences of the information in Meghan's hands. Speculation ran rampant in the palace, though very few dared speak it aloud. Some aides whispered that the project might involve intimate recollections of life inside the royal family, moments of tension, disagreement, or even perceived injustices. Others suggested it could expose institutional weaknesses or questionable decisions, carefully framed to highlight the human side of royalty. Every possibility added layers of complexity to an already tense situation. The very nature of a tell-all is inherently disruptive. It disrupts narratives, challenges perceptions, and forces audiences to question what they thought they knew. In this case, the stakes were higher than usual. We are not talking about a private family matter aired on a talk show. We are talking about an institution centuries in the making, a symbol of national continuity, and the intricate web of relationships that sustains it. The potential consequences were profound. Trust could be eroded, reputations tarnished, and the careful balance between privacy and transparency shattered. Harry had tried to gauge Meghan's intentions. Was this project meant to heal, to expose, or to assert agency in a world that had often felt confining? The answer was not clear. On one hand, there was evidence of thoughtful consideration, a desire to document experience, to speak openly, to challenge misconceptions. On the other hand, the scale, ambition, and potential fallout suggested that the project could be highly disruptive, even destabilizing, if not carefully managed. The palace's reaction, although measured outwardly, was filled with speculation and quiet anxiety. Every glance, every sidelong comment, every hushed conversation carried unspoken weight. Staff members, accustomed to discretion, found themselves navigating a minefield of assumptions and incomplete information. The project, still largely unknown, had already begun to influence the dynamics of the royal household, shaping conversations, altering perceptions, and heightening tension. What added to the gravity was the timing. In a world hyper-connected by media, social platforms, and relentless public scrutiny, timing is everything. Even the perception of intent can outweigh reality. If the project were released strategically, it could dominate headlines, dominate conversation, and dominate perception before the palace had a chance to respond. And Harry knew this. He understood that containment, mitigation, and preparation would be critical if the impact was to be managed. Charles, informed by Harry, approached the situation as a strategic puzzle. How could a monarchy, centuries in the making, respond to a threat originating from its own family? Every decision had repercussions. Confrontation could escalate tension. Preemption could backfire. Silence could be interpreted as complicity or weakness. The stakes were not hypothetical. They were tangible, immediate, and potentially transformative. Even the most mundane palace routines were now colored by the shadow of the alleged tell-all. Meetings, meals, and casual exchanges were infused with subtle caution. Conversations were measured, glances calculated, and every word seemed to carry dual meanings. The project's existence, though unconfirmed in detail, had begun to reshape behavior, perception, and expectation. In this environment, rumors gained extraordinary weight. Every fragment of information, every fragmentary hint, could be interpreted as confirmation. And with speculation spreading through the palace, the potential for misunderstanding or miscalculation increased exponentially. A single misinterpreted comment could escalate tension, alter relationships, or trigger unintended consequences. Yet, despite the uncertainty, Harry's sense of urgency remained acute. He knew that knowledge alone was not enough. Action was required. The project, though still shrouded in ambiguity, was moving closer to reality. And with each passing day, the potential for exposure, disruption, or scandal grew. The question was no longer what might happen. It was what would happen, and whether the palace could respond effectively in time. The tell-all, though not yet public, had already begun to exert influence. It shaped conversations, altered perceptions, and forced both family and institution to confront uncomfortable possibilities. For Harry, it was a delicate balancing act, protecting his family, honoring his spouse, and fulfilling his responsibilities to the monarchy. Each step required careful judgment. Every action needed strategic foresight, and every word could have consequences beyond immediate comprehension. As speculation intensified, Charles began to consider potential responses. Containment strategies, damage mitigation plans, and contingency measures all came under review. Yet, the uncertainty surrounding the project complicated every decision. Without full knowledge of content, timing, and intent, the palace's options were limited, and the stakes were magnified. Even a well-intentioned action could be misinterpreted, escalating tension rather than calming it. The palace, historically a symbol of stability, now found itself navigating a crisis of uncertainty. The tell-all had not yet emerged, yet it had already influenced behavior, perception, and strategy. Every glance, every conversation, every choice was now filtered through the lens of anticipation and caution. The future was uncertain, the stakes were high, and the whisper of a project had transformed into a palpable presence, shaping reality before it even existed. Harry knew that the coming days would test everyone involved. The dynamics of trust, loyalty, and responsibility would be challenged. Relationships would be strained. And the monarchy itself would be forced to confront the possibility of exposure and public scrutiny in a way it had not faced for generations. And yet, even as the palace braced for impact, the details of Meghan's alleged project remained elusive. What exactly would be revealed? Which truths would emerge, and which would remain hidden? And most importantly, how would the king respond when the time came to confront the reality, rather than the rumors? The answer, like the project itself, remained shrouded in mystery. But one thing was certain. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and when it arrived, it would test loyalty, judgment, and courage in ways that no one could fully predict. But what came next would push the family and the monarchy toward decisions that could alter the course of history, and no one was prepared for the storm that followed. The palace had always been a place of ceremony, tradition, and meticulous order. But on this day, it was something else entirely. The air inside the private war room felt different, charged, electric, taut with tension. It wasn't war in the literal sense. There were no armies or battle plans. Yet the metaphor was apartment. This was a war of influence, perception, and control, and the battlefield was the family itself. Charles had convened the room in response to Harry's revelation, not in a formal capacity, not for show, but with urgency that demanded attention and discretion. A select group of trusted aides and advisors had gathered, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and professionalism. The room, normally a space of calm deliberation, now carried a weight that pressed on everyone present. The whisper of Meghan's project had transformed into a tangible threat, and the stakes were higher than any protocol could contain. Harry had left, leaving the king and his inner circle to strategize. The meeting began quietly, with measured exchanges and careful observation. Every word mattered. Every glance carried meaning. The palace's experienced aides knew that what they were dealing with was unprecedented. A tell-all originating from the family itself wasn't just a problem to be solved. It was a challenge to the very foundation of trust and legacy. The king began the discussion by outlining the situation as Harry had presented it. Every detail was dissected, every nuance analyzed. Potential scenarios were considered, from the benign to the catastrophic. The room became a hive of analytical thought, tempered with emotional undercurrents that reminded everyone present that this was not a theoretical exercise. These were real people, real relationships, and the implications were immediate and profound. What if it's exaggerated? One aide asked, voice low. What if we're seeing shadows where there are none? Charles didn't answer immediately.
He leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly, weighing both the words and the intent behind them. In crises, perception can be as important as reality, and understanding motive is as critical as understanding fact. The team's speculation continued, exploring every angle, evaluating the credibility of sources, and assessing potential leaks, timing, and public reaction. Even as strategies were debated, subtle human dynamics emerged.
Some aides were visibly nervous, their loyalty split between the institution they served and the family they respected. Others were resolute, determined to provide guidance, reassurance, and possible solutions. The tension was compounded by the knowledge that any misstep could escalate an already volatile situation, amplifying its impact beyond the walls of the palace. One particularly sensitive topic arose: media response. Even before the project was publicly revealed, speculation had begun to leak into private circles. Reporters and commentators, always alert to the faintest whisper of controversy, were already forming narratives. The palace team recognized that the public would react instantly, and the speed of information in the modern age left little room for containment or control. Every potential statement, every defensive posture, every preemptive measure needed careful consideration. As the discussion progressed, Charles posed a question that struck at the heart of the dilemma. How do you respond when the threat originates from someone you love? Loyalty and duty collided. The monarchy is, by its nature, a symbol larger than any individual, yet its strength depends on the cohesion and trust of its members. A tell-all project from within the family challenged that cohesion in unprecedented ways. Harry's presence loomed over the conversation, even in his absence. The king's recollection of his son's urgency, his tone, and the subtle cues in his demeanor informed every strategy discussed. How much did Harry understand? How much was warning, and how much was interpretation? The room wrestled with these questions, knowing that the answers could determine the course of action. Discussion shifted to Meghan herself. The aides debated possible motives, intentions, and outcomes. Was this project a bid for empowerment, a response to perceived injustices, or a calculated move designed to influence public opinion? Each theory carried implications for how the palace should respond. Misreading intention could lead to overreaction, underreaction, or actions that might exacerbate tensions. Emotions ran high, even among those trained to remain composed. The stakes were not only institutional, but deeply personal. Staff members considered the strain on relationships, the potential for long-term damage, and the human cost of what might come. The war room, though designed for strategy, became a crucible of emotional tension, where intellect and feeling collided with consequences that were impossible to predict. Charles, steady as ever outwardly, understood the necessity of careful decision-making. Yet internally, he grappled with conflicting priorities. Safeguarding the monarchy, protecting his family, and responding with integrity and fairness. Each scenario was weighed meticulously. Every contingency plan was evaluated for feasibility, impact, and risk. The balance between transparency and discretion, between action and patience, was delicate and precarious. The aides proposed several potential strategies. One approach focused on containment, limiting access to sensitive information, monitoring communications, and attempting to understand the project's trajectory before it reached public view. Another strategy emphasized engagement, opening dialogue with Meghan, seeking clarity, and potentially mitigating impact through negotiation. A third approach suggested preemption, a controlled disclosure, framing the narrative to reduce shock and maintain credibility. Each option carried risks. Containment risked delay and speculation. Engagement risked escalation or miscommunication. Preemption risked public scrutiny and backlash. Charles weighed these carefully, considering both short-term consequences and long-term implications for family dynamics and institutional stability. As the war room discussions unfolded, the atmosphere grew heavier. The room itself seemed charged with anticipation, as if acknowledging that the decisions made within its walls could echo far beyond. Time felt both compressed and elongated, every second laden with potential consequence. The king's advisors offered insight, analysis, and perspective, but ultimately, the responsibility rested with Charles. He was not only a monarch, but a father, a husband, and a custodian of tradition and trust. The conversation turned to potential public fallout. How might audiences react to a tell-all from the royal family itself? Could public perception be managed, or would media narratives spiral beyond control? How would this affect the monarchy's standing both domestically and internationally? These questions, though speculative, were vital. The palace had to anticipate not only reality but perception, a task made more complex by the uncertainty surrounding Meghan's project. Tension reached a palpable peak when Charles addressed the room directly. We must be prepared for any eventuality. This is not just a family matter, it is an institutional matter. Every choice we make now shapes the perception of the monarchy for years to come. His words hung in the air, resonating with gravity, demanding attention, and emphasizing the stakes. As the meeting drew toward a temporary pause, aides exchanged glances, aware that the next steps would require precision, judgment, and courage. The whisper that had begun quietly had grown into a force, influencing behavior, shaping perception, and forcing decisions that would ripple through the family and the monarchy alike. The king remained seated, eyes thoughtful, considering the paths ahead. The war room, a place of strategy and counsel, had become a crucible for decision-making, testing intellect, emotion, and intuition. Every participant recognized the weight of history pressing down, the legacy of generations influencing the choices to be made, and the unpredictable power of revelation waiting just beyond the palace doors. And then, as the meeting concluded, a subtle realization struck. The storm was already in motion. The whisper had ignited a chain of events that no one could fully control. Even as strategies were formulated and contingency plans prepared, the coming days promised tension, uncertainty, and confrontation that would test loyalty, judgment, and resolve. But what came next would reveal just how high the stakes truly were, and the palace would never be the same again. In every family, there comes a moment when boundaries are tested, when loyalty, ambition, and personal convictions collide in ways that force decisive action. For the royal family, that moment had arrived. The whispered threats, the mounting tension, and the looming project from Meghan Markle had created a situation where inaction was no longer an option. The line had been drawn, and crossing it would have consequences that no one could ignore. Harry's warning to King Charles had set the stage. The palace war room had devised strategies, weighed contingencies, and prepared for multiple outcomes. But strategy alone was not enough. There needed to be clarity, a decisive assertion of authority, a recognition that certain actions could not be tolerated if the monarchy and family cohesion were to survive. And so, the king confronted the reality. There would be limits, and some lines could not be crossed. The line in the sand, as insiders would later describe it, was not just a metaphor. It represented a boundary between loyalty and defiance, between private ambition and public duty. For Meghan, the line was her choice to pursue the project. For Harry, the line was the loyalty to his father versus his devotion to his spouse. And for Charles, it was the necessity of protecting an institution he had inherited, along with the family it encompassed, from potentially devastating exposure. The decision-making process was tense and deliberate. Charles understood that any action he took would ripple far beyond the palace walls. A warning, a confrontation, or even a formal distancing from Meghan would send signals, not just within the family, but to the media, the public, and global observers. Every choice had consequences, every word carried weight, and the potential for misinterpretation was immense. To prepare, the king called a series of private briefings with senior advisors. They examined every scenario imaginable. What if the project became public? How could the family respond without appearing fractured or vindictive? Would preemptive action be seen as suppression or prudence? Each question sparked debate, revealing the delicate balance between authority and diplomacy, love and duty, personal loyalty and institutional responsibility. Meanwhile, Harry was caught in a crucible of his own making. He was torn between two powerful forces: his love and loyalty to Meghan and his respect and responsibility to his father and the monarchy. Every conversation he had with her became a negotiation of intent and caution. Every interaction with his father became a careful calibration of honesty and discretion. The pressure was unrelenting, and Harry knew that a single misstep could change everything. The tension extended beyond strategy. Emotional dynamics within the family were now central to every decision. Allies and advisors weighed in, bringing perspectives shaped by years of experience, loyalty, and understanding of public perception. Some urged restraint, warning against escalation that could feed the media frenzy. Others emphasized the need for firmness, arguing that a clear boundary must be communicated to prevent further risk. For Meghan, the project represented autonomy, voice, and perhaps a sense of vindication. But in the context of the monarchy, autonomy often clashes with protocol, voice often challenges perception, and vindication often provokes resistance. Every intention she had, whether to share her story, influence public opinion, or assert independence, intersected with the institution's need for stability and discretion. The line in the sand was not merely symbolic. It was a collision of worlds, where personal expression met centuries of tradition. Charles, experienced yet human, understood the stakes. His role was not simply to protect a reputation, but to safeguard an institution built over centuries. Loyalty could not be assumed. Trust could not be taken for granted. Decisions had to be grounded in principle, guided by foresight, and tempered by empathy. Every potential outcome was considered, every risk evaluated, and every step measured against the consequences it might bring. The line in the sand also marked a psychological shift. The family was no longer merely reacting. It was positioning itself for confrontation, whether direct or indirect. Boundaries had been established, and actions taken or not taken would carry meaning beyond their immediate context. For the first time, the members of the royal household felt the palpable weight of an impending rupture, one that could redefine relationships, roles, and perceptions. Media speculation, though still peripheral, began to intensify. Insiders who caught wind of private discussions hinted at tension, fueling curiosity and concern. The palace, usually insulated from rumor in its private halls, now faced pressure from both internal and external fronts. The line in the sand, while essential for clarity, also heightened the stakes. Any breach or miscalculation would be amplified, scrutinized, and dissected by the public and press alike. The king's approach was strategic yet personal. He recognized that a confrontation could provoke defensive reactions, exacerbate tension, and escalate the situation beyond control. Yet he also knew that failure to establish boundaries risked chaos, miscommunication, and long-term damage. The decision was not simply about authority. It was about preserving trust, maintaining credibility, and navigating a path where family loyalty and institutional responsibility coexisted, however tenuously. Harry, aware of the boundaries set, became both a mediator and a messenger. His role was fraught with complexity. He needed to communicate consequences, advocate for his wife, and maintain loyalty to his father. Every conversation was measured, every disclosure considered, and every emotional beat carefully navigated. The weight of history, expectation, and perception pressed down, making every choice consequential. Within this high-stakes environment, small interactions took on amplified significance. A glance, a remark, a gesture could signal compliance, dissent, or defiance. The palace, usually a realm of ritual and ceremony, had become a theater of tension, strategy, and psychological warfare. The line in the sand was no longer abstract. It was a tangible barrier shaping behavior, decisions, and relationships. As days progressed, the king's advisors prepared contingency plans. They considered everything: potential media responses, public perception strategies, internal communication tactics, and relationship management. Every scenario was scrutinized, every risk assessed, and every option debated. The palace had entered a state of quiet vigilance, where anticipation and caution coexisted in an uneasy balance. But the most critical realization was that the line in the sand was not static. It was dynamic, influenced by actions, intentions, and revelations yet to come. Every choice Meghan or Harry made could shift its location, heighten tension, or redefine boundaries. And every decision Charles made would reverberate through the family, the institution, and the public sphere, creating consequences that no advisor could fully predict. The tension reached a peak when Charles, in a rare moment of frank conversation with his inner circle, emphasized the gravity of the situation. We are dealing with more than a project. We are dealing with the trust, perception, and legacy of this family. The line has been drawn, but it is up to us to ensure it is respected and to act decisively if it is crossed. That declaration set the stage for what would come next: a confrontation, a challenge, and a series of decisions that would test loyalty, judgment, and courage in ways no one could foresee. The line in the sand was no longer just symbolic. It was the boundary between order and chaos, trust and betrayal, family and institution. And as the palace braced for what was to come, one truth became undeniable. Once a line is drawn, the next step, whether taken in defiance, compliance, or negotiation, can change everything. But what came next would push both father and son into a conflict that would have repercussions far beyond the palace walls, and no one was prepared for the storm it would unleash. The palace had always been a fortress of tradition, ceremony, and careful control. Every hallway, every room, every protocol was designed to maintain order and protect the reputation of the monarchy. But now, a new force had entered, a potential revelation from within the family itself, and the institution was forced to respond. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were urgent signals, demanding action, strategy, and delicate navigation. Inside Buckingham Palace, the response began quietly but with intensity. Senior aides convened in private chambers, away from the public eye, to assess the threat posed by Meghan Markle's alleged project. The atmosphere was tense, charged with a mix of concern, anticipation, and strategy. Advisors with years of experience knew instinctively that this was no ordinary challenge. It was personal, emotional, and unprecedented. The first step was assessment. The team gathered intelligence, piecing together fragments of information, observing patterns of communication, and scrutinizing subtle signals. Even before the project became public, the palace recognized that the potential impact was significant. Every piece of information was analyzed for credibility, intent, and timing. Every rumor, however small, was examined, because in moments like these, small details could escalate into monumental consequences. The response strategy focused on several key objectives: protect the family, safeguard the institution, and anticipate public reaction. These goals were intertwined, often conflicting, and required a balance between discretion and decisive action. Every scenario was considered: a delayed release, a controlled disclosure, a direct confrontation, or even a measured warning. Each approach had potential benefits and risks, and every decision required careful deliberation. Charles, fully aware of the stakes, maintained a steady demeanor. Outwardly, he remained composed and authoritative, but internally, he grappled with a complex web of responsibilities. He had to protect his family, ensure the stability of the monarchy, and navigate the unpredictable behaviors of those closest to him. The palace, normally a symbol of calm control, was now a hub of calculated tension. Communication played a critical role in the palace's response. Messages were carefully drafted, channels of information closely monitored, and allies consulted discreetly. Advisors debated the tone, content, and timing of any official response, knowing that the wrong approach could intensify speculation or provoke unintended consequences. In the modern media landscape, even the slightest slip could become a headline, spreading across platforms within minutes. Behind the scenes, contingency plans were formulated. Legal advisors considered potential ramifications, public relations experts outlined narrative control strategies, and internal communications teams prepared statements that could be deployed if necessary. The palace understood that while discretion was essential, preparedness was equally critical. A single misstep could undermine both family unity and public confidence. Meanwhile, Harry's role remained delicate. He was both insider and mediator, caught between loyalty to his father and devotion to Meghan. Every conversation he had, every disclosure he made, had implications for strategy and trust. The palace's response was informed by his perspective, yet the challenge lay in balancing personal insight with institutional priorities. Harry's position, fraught with emotional complexity, was both critical and precarious. Meghan, for her part, remained largely private, though hints of her intentions filtered through close contacts. The palace monitored these indicators carefully, recognizing that even subtle actions or statements could influence perception and strategy. Her project was still largely a shadow, but shadows can cast long consequences. Anticipation of its content shaped behavior, decision-making, and communication throughout the palace. The media, though not fully aware of the details, began to sense tension. Insiders' hints, carefully worded leaks, and observable shifts in palace routines fed speculation. The institution's response had to account for public curiosity, media scrutiny, and potential misinformation. The palace's communications team worked tirelessly, preparing to manage perception without prematurely confirming or denying details that could compromise strategy. The response also included personal measures. Charles met privately with key family members, reinforcing boundaries, clarifying expectations, and emphasizing the importance of unity. These conversations, while subtle, were deliberate. The king understood that internal cohesion was critical in managing both the immediate situation and the broader narrative. Family dynamics, emotional allegiances, and individual ambitions all intersected in ways that could amplify or mitigate the impact of Meghan's project. Yet, despite careful planning, uncertainty loomed. The palace could prepare, anticipate, and strategize, but the project itself remained largely unknown. Its content, timing, and tone were variables beyond control. Advisors recognized that while they could influence response and perception, they could not fully prevent disruption. This inherent uncertainty heightened tension, creating a sense of urgency that permeated every decision and every conversation. The response extended beyond strategy to symbolism. Even small gestures, seating arrangements at events, public appearances, and interactions with staff were scrutinized for meaning. The palace understood that perception shapes reality, and that symbols often carry as much weight as words or actions. Every decision became part of a larger narrative, influencing both internal cohesion and external credibility. As days passed, the palace response became increasingly sophisticated. Monitoring intensified, contingency measures were refined, and communication strategies were rehearsed. Advisors anticipated multiple scenarios, from the subtle leak of details to a full public disclosure. Every possibility was examined, every risk mitigated, and every message calibrated for maximum effect. Amid all this, Charles maintained perspective. His authority, experience, and understanding of both human nature and institutional priorities guided every action. Yet he remained acutely aware of the personal dimensions, the potential emotional fallout, the strain on relationships, and the human cost of maintaining the monarchy's stability. The response, while strategic, was grounded in the recognition that this was not merely a procedural problem but a deeply human challenge. Finally, the palace acknowledged a crucial truth. The response could not prevent the project entirely. It could prepare, anticipate, and mitigate, but the unfolding events were ultimately out of the palace's complete control. The task was not to stop history, but to manage its impact, protect relationships, and safeguard the institution's legacy. And just when the palace thought it had prepared for every possible outcome, a new piece of information emerged, a hint, subtle but undeniable, suggesting that Meghan's project was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. The whispers, once contained, were now on the verge of becoming a reality that could challenge everything the palace had strategized for. But what came next would force the monarchy to make decisions in real time, with consequences that would ripple far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace, and no one could predict the scale of the storm that was about to hit. The palace had strategized, prepared, and anticipated, but Meghan Markle was not one to be underestimated. Quietly, deliberately, she began to move. While the king and his advisors plotted responses and contingency plans, Meghan was working on her own terms, asserting her agency, and making it clear that the whispered project was not merely idle speculation. It was real, active, and ready to make an impact. It started subtly. Communications that seemed innocuous to the casual observer carried layers of meaning.